Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel, Building Sustainable Early Childhood Education. My name is Tate Sullivan, and I'm a senior reporter at EdSurge, a nonprofit newsroom that covers national education issues and where I write about early childhood. Today, we're going to talk about the incredible momentum around early childhood education, and specifically how to harness that momentum to build a better, higher quality, more sustainable field for families, for educators, and for kids. But to talk about that, we need to understand how we got here. To cut right to the chase, the early care and education system in the United States is fundamentally broken. Our government spends about $500 per child annually compared to our peer countries, which spend closer to $14,000 a year. Some people have called what the US has a non-system. Others have said it represents a market failure. Whatever you want to call it, it is letting down everyone who participates in it: families, educators, providers, and, importantly, children. This did not happen because of the pandemic. It didn't even happen during the pandemic. The challenges facing the early childhood sector are long-standing. The difference is they were mostly considered private plights prior to the pandemic. What changed is that people were forced to start paying attention, and what they saw was alarming. Let's recap how the field typically operates. Early childhood education services are delivered through a combination of programs, providers, and settings. That's why it's often referred to as a mixed delivery system, including licensed in-home and center-based childcare programs, family, friend, and neighbor care, public schools, community-based organizations, and the federally funded Head Start program. Families with young children are often forced to pay more than they can afford, sometimes more than the mortgages on their homes, for their children's early care and education, and that's if they can find it in the first place. Even then, that care is not necessarily high quality, and it can be inconsistent with limited hours or sudden closures due to staffing issues. I'm sure many of you have experienced this. Yet those who do the caring and educating of young children are among the most impoverished workers in this country. Salaries of childcare workers fall in the second percentile when ranked against other professions nationally, earning an average of about $13 an hour. It's not uncommon for early childhood educators to depend on public assistance such as Medicaid and food stamps, and they rarely enjoy workplace benefits such as paid time off and health insurance. Childcare providers, meanwhile, barely break even in the best of times. It is a business of razor-thin margins, and when revenue doesn't cover costs, providers will often dip into personal savings or take on credit card debt to avoid passing costs off to families who they know are already paying the maximum they can afford. What this means, in effect, is that children are often denied the high-quality, consistent care they need and deserve at a critical stage when their brains are developing more and faster than at any other time in their lives. So, again, all of this was true before the pandemic. But the pandemic made things worse, and it made things visible. Early childhood educators left the field at even higher rates than before, thanks in part to labor market pressures that created better paying jobs elsewhere. Thousands of childcare programs closed permanently, leaving families with even fewer options than they had before. Many programs that survived the pandemic are still not back to full capacity because they don't have the staff to take on more kids. As a result, countless parents, many women, have left the workforce to provide the care themselves. These dynamics revealed something to the public that was, until a few years ago, hiding in plain sight. Childcare is essential to the strength of our workforce and the health of our economy, and it is in crisis. Even as most of the US has rebounded from the pandemic, the early childhood sector remains in trouble. The workforce has not returned to pre-pandemic numbers. The higher costs of everyday goods and services have put additional pressure on already strapped providers and educators. In early childhood, the aftershocks just keep coming. So, what is the solution? How can we break this vicious cycle that is failing everyone involved? That is what we are here to talk about today. And fortunately, we have 3 brilliant women to help us sort through the answers. At the end here, we have Michelle Kang, who serves as the CEO for the National Association for the Education of Young Children, or NAEYC, a global nonprofit association advocating for high-quality early learning for all children. Natalie Renew is the director of Homegrown, a national initiative that works with home-based childcare providers around the country to increase resources for this critical childcare option. And right next to me, Mia Pritts is Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Wonderschool, a company that improves the supply and quality of childcare options by supporting in-home programs, employers, cities, and states to increase the access and sustainability of childcare. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to start by asking you to each share a story from someone in your orbit who you feel is representative of what the field is facing right now. So what are families or educators or kids up against? What are you each hearing? Michelle, maybe you want to go first?
Thank you, Emily, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I am delighted to be here on behalf of our 60,000 members and our 51 vibrant affiliates. Our mission is centered around each and every child having access to high-quality, developmentally appropriate early education in the setting that works best for their family. We work tirelessly on behalf of a field to elevate the work that they do to ensure that the work that they do each day with young children is valued, respected, and honored in professional practice. Our organization does this by lifting up foundational position statements, including developmentally appropriate practice and equity. And those practices are then seen through our publications, our accreditation of early learning programs and higher education programs, our professional development, and our conferences. But more than anything, I would be remiss if I didn't share that NAEYC is focused on being a place of belonging for all who work on behalf of young children 0 to age 8. This is personally important to me as the daughter of Korean immigrants, knowing how critical and important it is to have a place where you are seen, respected, and included. When you asked about a story, I have one that's very relevant because being here in Austin, I couldn't miss the opportunity to visit a program in Austin. So yesterday, I visited Open Door Preschool, which is the oldest NAEYC accredited school in Austin. It is a vibrant, wonderful program, the kind of place that we all want for young children. And in speaking with the director and meeting with the educators, I learned about the journeys of educators who have been there, including one teacher, Ken, who's been there for 30 years, so long that he is now teaching alongside children he has cared for in his time there, which is truly remarkable. I have to say that as I walked around the classrooms and observed what was happening on the playground, it was apparent to me that what was happening was joy in play. It is exactly what you want any child to be experiencing and what you want families to be experiencing. It's what you want educators to be experiencing in their practice, to be able to support young children as they discover and as they learn. And even despite this beautiful, wonderful program that they have managed to keep operating and supporting educators who have longevity, they too have not been immune from some of the challenges of our field. They explained to me and showed me a classroom that has been empty for a long time because they have not been able to recruit staff to come to be part of the program. And that translates into families who are not receiving care and who have to find and seek care elsewhere. And Cynthia explained to me that it has been difficult through this time because throughout the pandemic, the cost of care has had to increase because she had to increase her wages to be able to retain her teachers. And she couldn't pass on all those costs to her family. So even with the tuition she has to fundraise 25% of her budget. So, and she's committed to doing so because she cares so deeply and because she believes in the work that they are doing. But it has been challenging for her to operate and to have this program to support families. And I know that her story is not unique. We hear this from educators and programs all across the country in all settings, family childcare, Head Starts, in small programs, small centers, large centers. it's not unique. So what we have here is that families aren't able to access care, and educators are not being compelled to be in this profession because of the challenges of the low compensation and the lack of support. And it translates into a serious challenge for all of us and impacts our local economy. So as I contemplate and think about the stories that we hear, NACCE has been doing surveys throughout this pandemic. We heard from 12,000 people who explained to us that they've had lower enrollment and they continue to not be able to offer families. 80% of them continue to experience that. And we know that that is the crux of what we need to address here, is that if we do not do something about how we can find ways to support and recognize this workforce that is doing such critical work on behalf of young learners, that families are going to be not able to access care, and directors like Cynthia are going to be challenged to recruit and retain the highly trained and supportive and wonderful educators that we need on our programs to be able to sustain our communities and long-term all of our education systems.
Thank you. Natalie?
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. It's really a pleasure to be here. Homegrown is a national organization that works on behalf of home-based childcare providers in about 30 states. And our mission is really to ensure that systems see, value, and resource home-based childcare providers, inclusive of licensed family childcare providers, small businesses that are operated in homes and care for 6 to 12 kids, but also, and really importantly, family-friended neighbor caregivers. These are aunties, grandmoms, neighbors, and vested community members who step up and support families and communities in meeting their childcare needs. So today I'd like to share the story of Ruth. Ruth is a family-friended neighbor caregiver who lives just outside a large Midwestern city. She cares for 2 kids. One is the daughter of a relative, and the other is the child of a community member. Because Ruth is caring for the children of families who have low incomes and work irregular hours, she needs to have a second job. So she has a second job as a special needs screener and bilingual special needs liaison at her local school. In addition to these 2 really important jobs, Ruth also convenes a network of 200 family, friend, and neighbor caregivers in her community. These are primarily immigrant, monolingual Spanish-speaking women who step up and take care of children in their community and ensure that they have appropriate and high-quality early learning experiences. Ruth is one of 5 million family, friend, and neighbor caregivers caring for 11.5 million children between the ages of 0 and 13. And many families are choosing this form of care because it is small, it's intimate setting in the home, it's with somebody they know and already trust. There's continuous care to the family around their changing needs, their changing work needs, the changing needs of their children. And this care is really deeply embedded in community and culture. And families know that when their children are cared for in this setting by caregivers who love them, that they will have good outcomes. As we think about what are the challenges facing our sector, I think we have many challenges in terms of ensuring that all caregivers and providers, whether they work in a home, whether they work in a center, are recognized, are seen, and are valued, that public resources flow to these caregivers regardless of the setting that they care for children in, regardless of the number of children they care for, regardless of the age of those children that they care for, and that we create a sector where all caregivers feel that they belong and that they have a voice in designing what supports they receive and the different ways that they can show up to care for children and families. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you everyone for spending time with us today. At Wonderschool, we are working hard to build software to support existing childcare business owners, so center-based programs and home-based programs, tools to help them run their business day to day, because one thing we really know from COVID is that stabilization of existing programs matters a lot. We cannot have any more programs close. Family child care was on the decline well before COVID for all the reasons already mentioned, and so we need to help uplift and up-level the existing system. We also work to help people open new, licensed, high-quality in-home programs, and we're working in 43 states. And the story that I would like to share today is about a woman named Anitra. She lives in Nevada. She saw a need for childcare in her community, and she decided that she was the person to help address the needs that families have and that young children have. So she went through the Wonderschool new program opening process with us. She designed her program, she got her business plan ready, she got her space ready, and while she was doing this, she also signed up for a contest, a statewide contest, to do an elevator pitch. And the deal was whoever won the elevator pitch contest across all sectors in the whole state won $5,000. So Anitra signed up for the elevator pitch contest, spoke about her new childcare program, and won, which is really amazing and special, and we're so proud of her. After that, she was ready to start going through the childcare licensing process, which is typically done with inspections and regulatory agencies to make sure programs are safe, stable, and secure for young children. And in order to do that, she needed to get landlord approval. And so she went to her landlord and said, "Can I start this process? Can I operate a small in-home childcare program?" And not only did he say no, but he also evicted her. And so now, fast forward to today, she is living in a hotel while she is sorting out her options, and she's living off of her $5,000 prize money. She's paying for housing with that prize money for her elevator pitch contest win about her family child care program. And so we'll touch more on this later, but I hope that helps put some of the complexities that child care providers and families face all the time into perspective for you.
Thank you all. So I kicked things off by talking a little bit about the current crisis playing out in the field, but I'm curious what you would each add that you feel this audience needs to know to kind of understand the landscape right now. Maybe just briefly, fill in where you think I missed. You want to go first?
Oh, sure. One area that I can highlight for your awareness is that regulatory aspect that I mentioned. Childcare licensing exists in all 50 states, but as a separate entity in all 50 states, which means the rules and regulations and requirements and qualifications and inspection frequency and citation process and all of those different things are different in every state. This is really something in and of itself, but then an added layer is the licensing process for a family child care home and the licensing process for a center-based program are two different processes. They're regulated under different guidelines. And then another layer is family, friend, and neighbor care, which Natalie mentioned. Every state has a different definition of what that can look like. So in some states, you can care for one family's children. In other states, you can care for up to 4 unrelated children. In other states, you can care for up to 6. There's a lot of disparity between what those rules and regs are. And the same goes for licensed programs. In some states, you can care for up to 5 children as a sole provider, some states 6. And what we see is that it's really hard for child care program operators to break even, much less run a profitable business when they're legally not allowed to care for that 6th child who could be helping them break even, or there's such a high need in their community, but they're only allowed to care for this one family's children. And so there's a level of complexity that, I think adds a lot of nuance to what it really takes to open and sustain a successful program.
I will just add, Emily sort of mentioned this idea of a mixed delivery system which we define differently in different parts of the country, but really want to underscore the fact that families have more than one child, they have different childcare needs at one time, and those needs change over the life of their child. So often families are using multiple childcare options, maybe even more than two at a time. And so when we're talking about mixed delivery, we're really talking about what does it look like for home-based childcare providers, both licensed and informal, for centers that operate as standalone in community places and churches, and for schools and other institutional settings to be a part of the early learning system, and how do we equitably include those different settings in our high stakes, high reimbursement systems like pre-K, like Head Start, and other initiatives. So we have a long way to go to get to that, to ensure that different settings can really show up for families and be well reimbursed and participate in this mixed delivery system. But I think it's really important to just kind of underscore that families are diverse, their needs are diverse, and they change. So while you may need a full-time caregiver when your child is a baby, if your job changes and you now need to work a late shift or an overnight shift, you need 2 full-time caregivers, right? Or a different caregiving arrangement. Once your child gets a slot in your universal preschool system in your town or city, you now need aftercare and before care and summer care. So this is really dynamic, and we need a childcare system that is more adaptive and that ensures that resources can continue to follow children and families even as their needs change and their children develop.
Thanks. And I would say, I want to just first acknowledge that I think it's interesting that today our panel is on International Women's Day, because if there is ever an issue that impacts women disproportionately, it is for sure childcare, and in particular, Black and brown women, on which the childcare workforce has an overwhelming number of amazing small business owners who are Black and brown women who the industry has been built off of their low wages. And it's, we have to acknowledge that if we're thinking about women and women's progress, that childcare is an issue that we have to all be incented to be engaged in. One of the things that I would add, and I was contemplating this as I was thinking about coming here to South by Southwest conference, is that this conference is about education. And when you think about education, the continuum of education, there's such wonderful content spanning different topics in K-12 and higher education, about continuing learning, about neurodiverse learners. All of that starts in the possibilities of what can happen in early childhood. By the age of 5, 90% of the brain is developed. So if you think about that, and you think about what can happen in terms of those early connections that happen that help then create the foundations for success around behavior, around regulation, around emotional intelligence, around executive function, by investing in those early childhood years, you can see the outcomes in terms of what can be impacted in what happens in K-12 education and what K-12 educators then end up having to inherit. So I think it's important to name that it's in a continuum, and if we're really thinking about the continuum of education, thinking about education, sometimes what we hear is education really start before 5. Well, in our current system, it's funded by starting at the age of 5, but truly education starts by 0. And the most impactful education happens in those 0 to 5 years, which is why we need supported, respected, valued early educators to do the work. The other note I would say is this is also inextricably connected to higher education, because if we believe that educators should be supported and valued, then we need educator preparation programs that help support that pipeline of educators who are doing this care and doing this work. And higher education programs, especially community colleges, are often a pipeline for this. But because of the low wages and the challenges regarding the sector that we just talked about, we are disincentivizing early education as a field to go into. So we need to have the whole continuum to support this. We need higher education programs to continue to have this as a programmatic option at the community college level, in baccalaureate institutions. And these programs have slowly been fading away because of the lack of support, and because it's hard for someone with a degree to contemplate that they're going to be making on average $12 to $13 an hour.
Thank you. We cannot, in good faith, have a conversation about the sustainability of early childhood education without acknowledging the elephant in the room, which is that the U.S. could pretty well solve this crisis by funding early childhood the way that it funds K-12, so treating it as a public good instead of leaving families to figure it out for themselves. That is what many other countries do, after all. But unfortunately, it is not politically feasible in the US right now, and it may not be politically feasible for some time. So what we're here to talk about is what we can do in the meantime. And I want to ask you all, I want to spend the remainder of our time talking about what you are seeing that is real and accessible as far as a solution and innovation that could maybe offer some reprieve and ideally in the long term lead to a more sustainable system. So maybe we can start with you, Mia, of what you're seeing right now that is hopeful and promising.
Yes, thank you. There's so much opportunity. And I think, in times of struggle, new opportunity is born. And so it's really important for everyone in this room to leave thinking about how not to do the same thing the same way on the backs of Black and brown women, on the backs of individual families, particularly mothers. Like, we should not leave here thinking this will solve itself, because it will not. And going back to Anitra, the woman I spoke about earlier, she lives in Nevada, where the Department of Welfare and Social Services, who's the regulatory body or agency that manages childcare, is partnering using federal funds with an organization called Mission Driven Finance. And Mission Driven Finance is buying 40 homes in Nevada through a program called CARE that will be real estate investment properties for them. And they're doing that with the intent of buying homes that are licensable for group care, meaning the provider can care for up to 14 children with a staff member, and with the intention of becoming a child care friendly landlord. So one thing that I didn't mention when talking about fragmentation is every state also has different tenant rights or landlord rights or HOA rights. And in Nevada, all the rights lie with the homeowner, the landlord, or the HOA. And so this is going to circumvent that process by allowing childcare providers to rent these homes for several years, build their programs, potentially move on to buy the homes or open centers, or keep providing family childcare. And that's a really promising pilot for public-private partnerships, breaking through barriers in housing, while we wait for the policy to catch up on the other side of things. And policy changes can take a long time. The fact that it's easier to buy 40 homes to place childcare providers than it is to address the policy issue really says something right there. And so when you wonder, well, what can I do? You can keep an eye on it, and you can use your voice, and you can look for areas like this where there are barriers that are preventing someone like Anitra, who wouldn't want someone with that much grit and determination and passion to be able to care for children. We can work through these barriers on an individual basis, and an individual basis does matter while we're working towards a more comprehensive solution, because Anitra's program will serve children, and these children will go to kindergarten ready to learn and ready to become healthy, strong, lifelong learners, and they will then go on to get jobs and be contributors to their economies and communities. And in the meantime, their parents can go to work. And so it does matter on an individual basis. And I'm really happy to share that Anitra is one of the first approved providers who will be getting access to one of these homes in the CARE program. And so that is just such a relief, I think, for her, of course, but also for us to know that we're able to help provide assistance to really move her dream forward, but also move this access forward so she can reach families and children in her community.
It's amazing. It's really inspiring. I wanted to just share maybe two things that we're seeing around the country that give us so much hope and excitement for what's to come. Ruth, who I described earlier, is the leader of a network. She brings together 200 home-based childcare providers, and she sources and creates training and support for them that's really high quality, that's totally responsive to what the providers in her network need. And she has just secured a contract from the state in which she operates to do that with public money. This idea of providers really leading the way in terms of deciding what they need, from whom they need those supports, and that government can come behind and really support provider-led groups in meeting their needs really gives me a lot of hope, and I think there's a lot of excitement and a lot of opportunity to stand alongside educators and providers and ensure that they design the supports that meet their needs. I think much more practically, I think we are all in agreement that compensation is the biggest issue and the hardest nut to crack for us. And so at Homegrown, we are partnering with communities around the country in a project called the Thriving Providers Project, where we are using innovation from the guaranteed income sector to bring ongoing, predictable, and unconditional direct cash to home-based childcare providers, with the theory and a belief that when providers are financially and economically secure, that their willingness to engage in training, their ability to be sort of emotionally available and responsive caregivers improves, and that their journey, around quality can continue without interruption. So I think we've also seen really exciting things in Washington, D.C. and in other places where public payers are saying we recognize that compensation is sort of the first most important thing that we can do, and are making income supplements or bonuses available to the workforce. And I'll just say this works really well for providers. We also know it works really well for parents, and we saw with the child tax credit that getting direct cash that really recognizes the dignity, the autonomy of providers and parents can be a scalable solution that we pursue as we wait for the bigger system change to happen.
We need the bigger system change to happen. And I think there is much agreement when you put the elephant in the room out there, Emily, which is that we need a sustained, significant investment in recognizing the value of early childhood education. But to name, again, in the absence of that, we have to do what we can to continue to address the fact that families need care, educators need to be supported. And so what are some of those highlights in terms of opportunities that are not perfect solutions? And I do want to name that. I think that when we were discussing and thinking about how we address this, that absent the solution, we have to take incremental steps to make progress to address the care needs and the workforce needs. So two highlights I want to share. One is when I was studying effective organizations and thinking about how businesses and organizations can be effective in supporting employees in the most positive way, I came across the concept of thinking about workers more holistically, and instead of addressing workers and employees just as an employee doing one function, to recognize them as a multifaceted individual with all their identities that they come to work with. You know, I'm a daughter, I'm a mother, I'm engaged in my community, I have a special needs child. You know, I bring all of those identities with me when I come to the office and to workplaces, and so do most people. You don't leave behind your other identities when you come to the workplace. So I became fascinated and did work in the area of employer-sponsored childcare. And it's an area that has gotten some renewed focus, especially last week with Biden's announcement of the requirement that childcare is part of chips manufacturing. And I would offer that it's not a perfect solution, but it is a solution, especially in areas where there might be childcare deserts. And so those are areas where there is no affordable childcare, there's no affordable or quality childcare for many, many miles. So if you're thinking about the needs of your workforce and you contemplate that you're not able to support women in leadership roles, you're not able to support a diverse workforce, childcare can be a piece of that solution, and again, recognizing identities. And employers can put some skin in the game and put some real money into this to be able to address that as a challenge. And it doesn't have to be just on-site or near-site childcare. It can be putting money into other community-based solutions, putting money into having slots available at community-based childcare programs, family childcare homes, offering to put that money so that wages can be increased and you can create stability of childcare options for families. So there are ways forward in that, and it's not going to be perfect, because certainly I want to acknowledge that most on-site, near-site childcare solutions often address just a small portion of the population, but it can be expanded to think more broadly about how childcare supply and quality can be impacted for the community, which addresses the needs of the employers in a site who might see and hear that that is a significant issue for attracting workforce. The other thing I would just highlight and touch on briefly is, the military years ago recognized that this was a challenge for them as well. And as was named, it's an issue of national security, that their people could not find and have access to childcare. There were stories of people in the middle of the night being called to duty and to meetings, bringing their child with them because there's no care options, or even in the middle of the day because care broke down. So the military's had some significant investments, and they have, in addition to ensuring that there are accredited centers available at military bases, both near site and on site, have also put money towards supporting military families, accessing family childcare, accessing other community options, and ensuring that those options are at the quality level and affordable and accessible. So it's a highlight of something that, when you look back in their history, was very broken, and that they recognized needed to be addressed so that they could have, and we could have, a defense system that didn't have childcare breakdowns impacting the day-to-day.
So I actually spent the morning at an early childhood program that does some employer partnerships, and they were actually in the ground level of a building where the City of Austin employees were on the other floors, and those employees were given discounted tuition rates for their children to be in the program. And they also, having your kids on site, if you're a nursing mother, or, if anything goes wrong, it is also a benefit in itself. One of the criticisms of employer-sponsored childcare is that it's only for white-collar workers or desk jobs, which is actually not the case there. They offer it from their groundskeeper to a judge, a county judge, and it's same for the childcare provider that was doing this. They said that's true. They work with universities where the campus security guard has access to it, and so do the professors. So I do think that is maybe changing, but I'm curious what you all would say. That does seem to be getting a little bit more traction as an option that is emerging in the absence of federal action. So, what could go wrong here? Creating a benefit by your employer is similar to healthcare, and obviously that has some drawbacks too. So what do you think about that option?
I think that employers should have skin in the game, just like Michelle said. They're contributing members of their communities and society as well, and they have a need to be met so that they can hire people who can show up and do their best work, whether that is as a shift worker or a judge. There's a need, across all industries and types of positions. And so this is one of the places where I think there's a lot of opportunity to think really creatively and really differently than we always have. I also worked in employer-sponsored care for about 5 years, and I loved it. I loved working in an on-site center and managing different centers and meeting the needs of those children and families, and it does not nearly match the needs that exist out there. And so I think one way to think differently about it is, flip the script. Instead of care being provided only on site, how can we make care available that more uniquely matches the needs of each unique family? So does care need to be offered closer to where your employees work? Do they need extended hours? Do they need overnight care? Do they need care that can accommodate children with special needs? Do they need multilingual care? Do they prefer multilingual care? And so one of the ways I think we can do that is through building up networks and family childcare offerings, which is not what employers think of first. And so they need some help thinking new, creative solutions. And I think a lot of employers are really at that point where they are willing to think differently. Maybe reimburse tuition for employees at a particular level, but where the employee picks care versus only being on site. We're working with an employer in California who was doing some concierge service for their employees. So, someone can help them find care in a program nearby, and there's literally no spaces available. So what they're doing now is funding a family childcare program to open and get licensed and operate, and that will help address the needs of their employees by offering, it's bringing new spaces, and also will meet the needs of community members who will also have the option to enroll in that program. And so I think that we shouldn't shy away from employer participation. I believe that rather we should expect it and insist on it and help, come up with those new, unique ways of meeting needs that hasn't been done previously. And I think that will help address things like lower income earning families or families who haven't typically been thought of as like the constituent for employer sponsored care. And that gets to really ensuring that all children have access to these high quality early learning experiences.
I also want to highlight that employers have a lot of power in their voice. And one of the things that we have seen is an increasing amount of employers who are lending their voice to saying, this is an issue for us, because we see how our employees are suffering, we're losing employees, and we need to address this. And so in the state of Maine, the employers came together and actually helped to support a wage supplement for early education workers and lent their voice. Here in Texas, there was a letter sent just a few weeks ago saying that childcare is a challenge. It's a challenge for employers and for the economy. And what I would love to see is more of that as we think about how we bring together people to continue to raise and lift up what this profession does, the work of early educators, but also shine the light and bring together more voices so that eventually we'll see the sustained significant investment that we need in early education, but in the meanwhile, that we're continuing to move the needle forward on gaining support for the value of early education.
Natalie, I wanted to ask you to share a little bit more about the Thriving Providers Project. I think, there is no doubt a lot of really exciting things happening in the early childhood space right now. The question is the scalability. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how, I think it's direct cash payments to providers, right? So universal basic income. And, is that something, what is the funding source for that? And is that something that we could implement elsewhere?
Sure. So the design of the Thriving Providers Project is to really pilot direct cash payments with an eye towards a policy reform, which is to say, how might we take the current funding in the system and use it in a way that looks more like direct cash transfers? So instead of, piecemeal reimbursements or, things like that, that we really use the current system dollars to invest directly in the workforce in a stable and predictable way. We think that this is very scalable. Direct cash payments, as we've seen with the child tax credit and with now really hundreds of pilots that are popping up around the country, are very administratively lean programs. They're relatively easy to implement. And I think, they are equitable in terms of how they can be implemented. There's a lot of interest around direct cash programs, guaranteed income programs. We've seen significant leadership from mayors around the country. This past week, a consortia of counties kind of announced that they were committing to guaranteed income work, and we've seen states like California and Colorado really step up and create guaranteed income funds. And you know, a lot of this work has happened for new moms and other populations that can really benefit from direct cash. So I think there's both a lot of interest. I think we know that it's feasible and doable administratively. The child tax credit, again, was just this amazing experiment at what happens when we give the individuals most proximate to young children direct, predictable, ongoing cash. And it raised millions of families out of poverty, and we saw the money being used in ways that I think no administrator could have done better, right? Families spent it on food, basic needs, educational materials for their young children. You know, so I think there's just a lot of promise here. And I think it's a way to really, again, put families and providers in the driver's seat around what the system can and should look like. Providers and families are really undermined in their ability to get to the table because they're spending so much of their time and effort navigating complex social service systems, worrying about how they're putting food on the table and paying rent. And this is a program that can both support their financial well-being, but again, underscore their value to our communities and their decision-making and dignity.
We know that to have a sustainable field, we need a sustainable workforce and a full workforce. And someone in the audience has asked the question about the lack of respect for the profession. They say even walking the expo, never mind, there it is. Even walking the expo floor here, there's sighs and irritation when mentioning the ages we work with. I mean, that is a big problem. Wonder what you all would say to that.
I mean, it's a lack of understanding of the impact of the work, really, when it comes down to it. And I'm not sure, I want to believe that we all here in education want the best for children, we want the best for outcomes in you know, our youngest learners to our oldest learners, that we're all lifelong learners. And I think that there's a misunderstanding at times of the impact of the work of people caring for babies and toddlers and preschoolers. We deal with this misnomer, and we often get called, you know, you're babysitters, you don't need training to do that, anyone can take care of children. And what we know is that when you have people who are supported and who have the ability to have been trained in child development practices and receive that ongoing support, that the outcomes for young children are very positive. This is an issue that is not new. We have dealt with this for many years, and I would say that we all need to continue to use our platforms and our spaces to talk about impacts of early childhood education. The economic impacts are clear. You know, it's 13% return on investment for every dollar that we invest in those 0 to 5 years. We look at, again, the brain development and what happens in terms of outcomes for learning, for literacy, for growth and social emotional development. And I would offer that it's going to be an ongoing challenge for us to help people understand the value of the work. For a moment, the beginning of the pandemic shined an incredible light on it. It's faded a little bit, but we need to bring the light back.
I think it is fair to say that the lack of respect for the profession is historically linked to the demographics of the profession, which are almost all women and largely women of color. Someone else in the audience asked, childcare issues are racial issues. Can you speak to the disparities for Black and Brown providers and in access for Black and Brown families?
I'd be happy to start this one off. I think there are a couple of different dimensions that I'd like to sort of explore here, which is that this is historic, and I think we've really kind of got very comfortable exploiting the labor of Black and Brown women in our sector. And so the roots here are very deep. As it relates to kind of the frame of home-based childcare, I think from the provider perspective, home-based childcare providers are more likely to be women of color. So 50% of that workforce are women of color versus 40% in center-based care. I think we understand from the consumers who choose to use home-based childcare that one of the key reasons that they're using home-based childcare is because they want racial, ethnic, and cultural congruence with their own family. So they're seeking out providers who look like them, that speak like them, and have shared, child rearing practices. And I think in many ways this is why home-based care is really not as visible and not as well supported as other forms of care, because this is really a majority of Black and brown workers, which again is true for the broad sector as we think about it from a societal perspective. So I think this is a really significant issue. Again, my belief is that if we can prioritize the adults that matter most in young children's lives, their parents and the childcare providers and caregivers who show up for those children and their families every single day, and we can really use significant acts like, housing and pay, I think that's really the place to start with some of these issues. And I think it's worth just putting on the table that we need to have honest conversations about what quality means and whether our definitions of quality are shared across multiracial, multi-ethnic communities. And I think, again, bring providers and families into that conversation to create a set of definitions and standards and processes that reflect what those families and providers need, want, and value.
I think it's so important. What Natalie shared is important about, again, addressing the fact who is doing this work. And I go back to, when you look back in this industry, about the people who've been creating regulations and rules in this space have not been the people who have been doing this work. We have to go back to the lived experiences of those who are doing the work and reflect and contemplate and honor that as we think about the system. So we have had decades of systemic racial inequity in the system. I think the good news is that there are many of those who are working very hard to elevate and to dismantle those structural inequities so that we can address who's been doing the work, how they've been doing the work, honoring their story and their experiences, and making sure that as we construct systems of support for them, in addition to addressing the compensation that doesn't reflect the day-to-day work that they do, that we're also addressing some of those other barriers that Natalie and Mia and I have talked about in terms of what's in the system, and that we're collectively as a voice working to make sure that local policymakers and advocates are including educators at the table whenever possible when they're talking about how we can address making sure that we're serving the needs of the families who need the care and reflecting the diversity of their experiences and what their needs are, but then also reflecting that in those who are doing the work, whether they're in family child care or in centers or in Head Start, that we see them and we say, what is your experience like, and how can we address making that experience positive because you're doing such important work on behalf of young children?
Another audience question: what can researchers do to provide support and build a bridge between providers and policymakers? And are there organizations we can join to work in this space?
You can join NACI. But there are many organizations who are like-minded working in this space, who are producing research, that are putting out position statements and foundational information. We're excited about the administration funding a workforce center on behalf of early childhood, and excited about the work that they're going to be doing. There are many partners in this space: 0 to 3, Childcare Aware of America, the Workforce Center at Berkeley, Child Trends. We're all doing this work in partnership with each other. The National Association of Family Childcare is another one. But and each organization, there are researchers who are doing the work, and the piece I would offer that I just said, which is, if we're doing research, that we go back to making sure that we're hearing provider voice. Whoever that provider is, that their voice is included, so that it is then reflected in the findings, which will be grounded in the reality of what is happening day to day.
I would just add very briefly, pay them. Employ providers to be a part of your research teams and to help you do this work.
Yes.
At Homegrown, we have employees as a part of our staff called providers in residence, who are fully integrated staff members that help us implement our work. But I think that's the place to start, is to really bring them in as trusted members of your team with as much expertise as you and others on the team have. And then I would also just offer that there is a project out of the Stanford Graduate School of Education called the Rapid EC Project that does ongoing data collection from both childcare providers and parents of young children. That's a really rich resource and an important kind of place to start some of these conversations in community with both parents and providers.
Yeah, I think I would just add too, if you're looking to do something, it's just talk about it. Like Michelle mentioned, the main workers who were talking about how important childcare is to having a fully staffed workforce. If you're a parent and you are dealing with this, don't keep it private. The more people talk about this, I think the more that it's going to be acknowledged as a universal problem. And relatedly, I think our final question I want each of you to answer is, why should the crisis in early childhood be a national concern and not just an individual responsibility?
Childcare is infrastructure. It's what makes everything else go, from school readiness to lifelong success as an individual human to workforce and strong communities. And I think that, as we all have discussed, COVID has really shined a light on the cracks in the system, or the crevasses as they may be. But we also know that where there are cracks, that's where the light can get in, and we need to really make sure not to lose sight of this opportunity, because it matters for all of us, no matter what stage of life we're in, no matter how or where we work. This impacts all of us, and just keep fighting the good fight.
Not much to add. I would just say I think childcare is really the way that we transfer cultural assets, and that we love and care for children in community, and it's really critical to their success, to the success of their parents, and to our communities and our economy. And I agree, we all have to stay in the fight.
We all know someone impacted by childcare, whether you're a working mother and you are impacted by it, or you are an aunt or a sister or a coworker. Childcare is in all of our orbits some way, shape, or form. And it is essential, as we think about the future health of our country, that we are thinking about how to make wise investments in those dollars and supporting our early educators in doing this work. They're doing brain development every day. Doing this brain development, for them to be supported and seen, and for us to support them and to support each other and continuing to elevate the importance of this, is critical for our long-term health and future.
Well, thank you all, and please join me in thanking these three panelists.